If you're like me, then you have no shortage of biodiversity in your lawn in the form of weeds of all shapes and sizes. While I keep the backyard looking pretty rough over the past few years, I wanted to make the front yard that you see here a little more presentable, but didn't want to be out there applying anything too harmful to my pets, children, or the environment. It was around this time that I learned about this product from Natria, which is basically an iron heta concentrate. Before purchasing, just to do my due diligence, I thought I would check out what the EPA had to say about iron heta applications, and I found an executive summary where they seem to conclude that, based on the data available to the agency, it has been determined that no unreasonable adverse effects to the U.S. population and the environment will result from the use of the active ingredient when label instructions are followed and good agricultural practices are employed. They then go on to say that studies indicate that iron heta will not cause adverse effects to mammals, birds, fish, and aquatic invertebrates, other non-target insects, or plants. That sounded good enough to me, so I thought I'd give it a try. So the manufacturer recommends that, for a spot treatment, that you combine 5 ounces of the concentrate along with 1 gallon of water. I'm using this very basic and affordable pump sprayer here that I will link in the description, but any sprayer should do. If you really don't want to bother with a sprayer, Natria also sells a 24-ounce ready-to-spray version of this with water already mixed in. But the price point is a little better with the concentrate in terms of the amount of herbicide that you're actually getting for your money. Natria then goes on to recommend that when performing a spot treatment, go ahead and apply this thoroughly to the point of runoff, while using your sprayer in the coarse setting to reduce drift. Once it's all in there and you've got your pump sprayer back together, just give it a good shake and you're ready to go. So as I have many different weeds to choose from, I've prepared 2 separate areas to be treated in my backyard, as well as one on the side of my house. I've actually got just about every weed on the front of the bottle, as we're going to be applying this on clover, dandelion, thistle, moss, creeping Charlie, and also common chickweed. I'm also going to spot spray some dandelions that are growing in an area that I seeded with new grass about 3 weeks ago, so we can check if this stuff is harmful to new grass. The plan is to show you each of the areas before the application, a few hours after the application, and then a full week after the application in order to show you how effective this stuff is with a basic spot treatment. Then, based on the results we see, I'll be giving an effectiveness score on a scale of 1 to 5 Natrias, as well as a time-required score to summarize how long it took to see the results for each of the weeds. Also, I wanted to mention here that I'm applying this during the fall, and the temperatures are definitely on the cooler end of the recommended temperature range. The manufacturer recommends that you apply this stuff anywhere from 50 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 85 degrees. So let's get right into it. Here's the first spot that I marked off where we'll be applying the treatment to 3 different weeds. If you look in the middle here, you can see there is a fairly well-established patch of clover sandwiched right up against a few dandelions. This stuff has likely been growing for most of the summer, so it should be a good test for this application. Then up in the top left corner of this area is a stubborn thistle. These things are no fun if left unchecked, especially if you have small children in the yard, as they get extremely sharp and prickly. I'll go ahead and speed up the video here, as I had to position the camera, grab my pump sprayer, and then wait a minute for the wind to die down. I tend to apply this stuff as early in the morning as possible, assuming there is no dew on the ground, in order to minimize drift. Okay, so you can see that I'm trying to apply it just to the point of runoff as recommended by the manufacturer, but I don't really want to over-apply, as I want to give you a fair representation of a normal spot treatment. It's also interesting that this product doesn't contain a surfactant to help it stick to the weed, so you really want to apply it to the point where you can see it sitting on the leaves of the plant in order for it to be effective. But more on that later. So in the second area here, we have a large spread of moss that reaches well outside our 4 flags, as well as a decent-sized thistle there, right at the bottom of the area. They list moss as one of the lawn diseases that this will help prevent, but I thought we'd go ahead and see how effective a spot treatment is in killing the stuff. I initially sprayed just within the markers, but then decided to go ahead and hit all the moss in the area in order to paint a better before and after for you guys. Okay, so in our third and final area here, we have a very well-established patch of common chickweed. Pretty sure this stuff has been growing there all summer. On the side of the area is the newly seeded grass that I mentioned earlier in the video, where I'll go ahead and hit a few dandelions growing through that straw mat in order to find out if this stuff is too strong for baby grass. I'm going to really try to get enough on there so that you can see it beating up on the leaves of the plant, which honestly are not that big, but again, with no surfactant, You really want to be getting some on there. Now that we've got everything applied, it's time to hurry up and wait. Cue the obligatory SpongeBob transition, please.
2 hours later.
Okay, so since they do say see results in hours on the packaging, I thought we'd go ahead and check in just a few hours after applying. That, and because honestly, who doesn't love SpongeBob transitions?
Nice.
You can see in our first area here that our clover is looking a bit darker and less robust, and the afternoon sunlight is giving us a decent look at both the dandelion as well as our thistle, which both appear a little bit darker as well. No drastic changes yet, but the plants definitely do not look any healthier. That much is for certain. Okay, so heading on over to area number 2, you can see that not only is the mossy area much more darker than the light green color that we saw prior to the application, but the thistle is also looking a bit more sickly. In particular, you can really see the sheen left on the plant, as the herbicide did a great job of adhering to this specific weed. Oh, and remember how I mentioned Creeping Charlie earlier? Here's a bonus area just to the right of the moss, where I found and sprayed some of this pesky weed as part of the morning's application. If you look closely, you can see that it's already not doing that great as the edges of the leaves look a bit burnt. So let's be sure to check in with this one as the week progresses. And finally, here's a look at that big patch of common chickweed just a few hours after our application. I got a great side-by-side shot of the before and after, and you can see how the plant looks much darker than before the application, especially where the substance was able to pool up on the leaves' surface area. A pretty decent start for treating something this established. Also, remember how I mentioned we'd be spraying a dandelion on top of some newly seeded grass? Keep an eye on this guy right here in the middle of this straw mat. This grass has been growing for a couple weeks now, so it's not brand new seed, but thought I'd throw it in there just to see what happens. Okay, so the moment we've all been waiting for, let's check out the results a full week out. Cue the second SpongeBob YouTube transition, please.
A few moments later.
Okay, so here we are at our first area 1 full week later. But before we go ahead and show the results, let's go over the rating scale with which we'll use to summarize how well the Natria worked, as well as how much time it took to take effect. I will be awarding a single Natria to any weed that seemed to be killed off very well by just this initial treatment. Anything that doesn't seem to respond is likely going to take another spraying, so those weeds will receive multiple Natrias. Likewise, with the clock icons, whichever weeds seem to die off right away will get a single clock, whereas the more stubborn weeds, where we aren't seeing results for a longer period of time, will be getting multiple clocks. All in all, a smaller score is going to indicate where the product was most effective, a higher score where it was least effective. Keeping with the idea here that when using any selective herbicide, no matter how quote-unquote healthy it is, your goal should be to use as little of it as possible. Okay, so here we are at our first area again. This is 1 full week later, and you can see that our patch of clover here is looking very dark and crispy. If we zoom in a little closer here, you can really see just what rough shape this stuff is in. The dandelion next to it is looking even worse, as you can see how it just crumbles apart in my hand, and there is another dandelion at the top of the screen there that's not doing much better. Our friend the thistle here is taking a little bit more time to get as crispy as the dandelions, but doesn't look like he'll be surviving this application either. So if we hop back over to our rating scale, I'm going to go ahead and give the clover 2 Natrias, as it looked like the treatment was fairly effective, but the plant wasn't totally annihilated or anything. The dandelion and thistle, however, looked like they were in very rough shape and basically ready to disintegrate, so those will each receive only a single score. As for the amount of time it took to kill off each weed, again I think the clover seemed to be a little more resilient than the dandelion and thistle, so I'm going to give it 2 clocks, and then only award a single clock to the other 2. I should also mention that when I've applied this before in the heat of summer, everything tends to respond faster to the applications, but the clover still often lags behind the dandelion and thistle. So, over in our second area, our thistle here is looking dead and crispy, whereas the moss is looking just a little darker than when we checked on it the first day. This stuff is meant to mostly prevent moss growth, but in the past, I've had success spraying existing moss along with the surrounding areas before trying to remove the moss, or cover it with topsoil for reseeding. I've also had decent results similar to what you see here. So on our rating scale, let's go ahead and give our moss a single Natria for effectiveness, along with a single clock, as I haven't seen a whole lot of change really since the first few days. Checking in on this pesky creeping Charlie over here, we can see that there is more of a range of results, with some of it looking like it is definitely not coming back next season, whereas in other areas it looks a bit less affected by our single application. If we're being totally honest, I've also found with past treatments that this is probably the toughest of all the weeds that I have to deal with. I find that with multiple treatments, you can kill a good portion of it. But if you plan on a single treatment, then you are basically just keeping the stuff in check, as it's quite a hardy adversary. Putting all that into consideration, let's go ahead and give this 3 Natrias in terms of effectiveness, and then also 3 clocks in terms of the time involved in getting rid of this weed, as I've found it's about 3 times as stubborn as something like a dandelion that seems to die almost within 24 hours. Also, if we look at a freeze frame of the grass around the application area, you can see a little bit of staining. I tend to see this more in areas where I've had repeat applications of the stuff, so that's something else to consider. You can typically just water in the area a bit a few days later, and then it should be just about gone by the end of one mowing cycle. But definitely expect to see a bit more of this staining if you're applying it when the weather is at the top of the temperature range, or during periods of drought where the surrounding grass is already stressed. Okay, so on to our third and final area where we find this big patch of common chickweed, surrounded by the newly seeded grass underneath our straw mat. You can see that this stuff is looking considerably worse than it was a week ago. But similar to the creeping Charlie, certain areas have taken to the treatment better than others. As I alluded to earlier in the video, whenever you have more surface area on which this herbicide can rest and get absorbed, you tend to end up with a more effective treatment. And this is a great example with the common chickweed, as the denser areas seem to already be black and crispy, whereas the more sparse areas are holding on a bit longer. In terms of rating, I would go ahead and give this a single Natria, along with 2 clocks, as when I've done previous applications, I've noticed that this stuff is super effective on common chickweed, but that it also takes a slightly longer time to kill this specific weed for some reason. Oh, but wait. We forgot to check on that dandelion that was growing through our straw mat to see if there was any residual damage left on the new grass. Well, if we pan over here and take a look, you can see that the dandelion is absolutely destroyed, and yet the grass is looking green and healthy, so looks like this stuff is fairly safe when used as directed on new grass as well. So if we do a real quick recap of how our Natria fared against the various weeds in my backyard and rearrange things like so, you can see that it was the most effective against the dandelion, thistle, and moss, whereas the clover and common chickweed take a little longer to show results, and the creeping Charlie, at least in my experience, is most likely going to take multiple applications if you want to totally get rid of it. Well, that's it for this one, and hopefully with the help of Natria, you can get your yard looking a little less like what you see here, and a little more like this. If you found the video to be of some value, be sure to subscribe and also hit that bell to allow notifications, as it really helps out the channel. Product link is in the description. Thanks.